I thought I was having a stroke. That's the only way I can describe what happened when the nurse leaned down close to my ear and whispered those words. My whole body went cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when you walk outside in January. The kind that starts in your chest and works its way out to your fingers. The kind that tells you something is very, very wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Norman. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing glamorous. But I was good at it. I showed up early, stayed late, never called in sick unless I was genuinely flat on my back. When I retired 4 years ago, my boss shook my hand and said I was the most reliable man he'd ever employed. I still think about that sometimes. My wife, Patricia, God rest her soul, used to say I was too reliable, too trusting. She'd say, "You see the best in people, even when they're showing you the worst." She wasn't wrong. Patricia passed away 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to gone. 11 weeks. There are days I still reach for the phone to call her. We had 2 children together. My son Kevin, 34, lives about 40 minutes from me in Westerville, and my daughter Melissa, 31, lives in Phoenix with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, a boy 6 and a girl 4. Those 2 kids are the reason I get out of bed some mornings. I mean that literally. After Patricia died, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit in that house and decay. I'd seen too many men do that, lose their wives and just fold. I started walking every morning. I got my cholesterol under control. I visited Melissa out in Phoenix twice a year. I had Kevin over for dinner on Sundays whenever he wasn't busy, which, I'll be honest, became less and less frequent over time. But I told myself that was normal. He had his own life, his own pressures. Kevin had gone through a rough stretch about 5 years back, lost his job at a logistics company, burned through most of his savings, racked up some credit card debt that took him a while to climb out of. I helped him. Of course I helped him. He's my son. Over the course of about 18 months, I gave him somewhere around $40,000, not as a loan, as a father helping his child get back on his feet. Patricia was still alive then, and she supported the decision, though she did say, quietly, one night, "Just make sure he understands this doesn't come without responsibility." I nodded and said, "Of course." I don't know that I ever had that conversation with Kevin as directly as I should have. He got back on his feet, found a better job, met a woman named, well, I call her what she is, a problem. Her name was Sherry. They got engaged about 2 years after they started dating. I tried to like Sherry. I genuinely did. She was pleasant enough on the surface, polite at holidays, but there was something behind her eyes when she looked at me that I could never quite put my finger on. Patricia would have known what it was immediately. Patricia read people the way I read blueprints. About 8 months before everything happened, Kevin started calling more regularly, which should have made me happy, and it did at first. But the calls always had a shape to them. They'd start warm. "How are you, Dad? How's the knee? Did you watch the game?" And then they'd ease into questions about my finances. Nothing direct, nothing you could point to, just questions. Had I thought about what I wanted to do with the house after I was gone? Had I updated my will recently? Had I considered setting up a trust to avoid probate? Did I have a financial advisor? I answered honestly each time because that's what I do. I didn't think much of it in the moment. He's my son. I assumed he was just being responsible, planning ahead, thinking about the family. What I didn't know was that Sherry had put him up to it. I didn't know that until much later. About 4 months before everything came to a head, I started having some chest pains. Not dramatic, not clutching my arm falling to the floor stuff. Just a tightness. A pressure that came and went. My primary care doctor referred me to a cardiologist at Ohio Health Riverside Hospital, a man I'll call Dr. Whitfield, because that's his name. And I'm not going to protect him with an alias. He saved my life. He ordered a stress test, an echocardiogram, the whole picture. The results showed some blockage in one of my arteries. Not an emergency, but not something to ignore either. He recommended a procedure, a cardiac catheterization, possibly followed by a stent placement, depending on what they found. I told Kevin about it the same night I found out. He came over, sat at my kitchen table, and I watched his face as I explained what the doctor had said. He nodded. He asked good questions. He seemed concerned. He hugged me before he left and said, "We'll get through this, Dad." I held on to that. I held on to it hard. The procedure was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. I had to be at the hospital at 6 a.m., couldn't drive myself home afterward, so Kevin said he'd take me. Melissa offered to fly in from Phoenix and I told her it wasn't necessary. It was a routine procedure. I'd be home by afternoon. No reason to uproot her and the kids. She made me promise to call her the moment I was out. The Sunday before the procedure, Kevin came over for dinner. He brought sherry, which was a little unusual. She didn't come to Sunday dinners very often. We had pot roast. We talked. It was a good evening, or at least it seemed like one. After dinner, Kevin pulled some papers out of a folder he brought with him. He said he'd been working with an estate planning attorney and thought it would be a good time, given the procedure coming up, to get some things formalized. He had a new will drafted for me to look at. He had a healthcare proxy document. He had a durable power of attorney. I looked at the papers. I'm not an attorney, but I know how to read a document. The power of attorney was broad, very broad. It would have given Kevin essentially full authority over my finances in the event that I became incapacitated. I asked a few questions. He had answers for all of them. Smooth answers. Practiced. I told him I wanted to have my own attorney look them over before I signed anything. Kevin nodded and said of course. No rush, just wanted me to have them. Sherry didn't say anything during this exchange, but she watched me, and something about the way she watched me stayed with me all that night after they left. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Patricia's voice. You see the best in people even when they're showing you the worst. I thought about the questions about my finances, the timing of the visit, the practiced answers. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was just a son worried about his father going into a medical procedure. I told myself a lot of things. The next morning, Monday, the day before the procedure, I drove to the hospital for a pre-op appointment. Routine blood work, going over the anesthesia protocol, signing consent forms. I've been to this hospital 4 or 5 times in the past few months and I'd gotten to know a few of the nurses by name. There was one woman in particular, a cardiac care nurse named Louise, who had a warmth about her that reminded me a little of Patricia, professional and kind at the same time, the kind of person you're glad exists in the world. After my appointment, I was in the hallway putting my coat back on, getting ready to leave, when Louise appeared beside me. She touched my arm lightly to get my attention, which she'd never done before. I turned and I saw something in her face, a carefulness, a deliberateness. She glanced both ways down the hallway, and then she leaned in close and she said, very quietly, "Mr. Norman, I need you to listen to me carefully. Don't react. Don't change your expression. Just listen." I went very still. She said, "I shouldn't be telling you this. I could lose my job, but I have a father your age, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't say something." I waited. She said, "A man came in here this morning asking about your procedure. He spoke to one of the front desk staff. He asked very specific questions. What time you'd be in recovery, what kind of medication you'd be given, how long you'd be under sedation. He asked whether patients in your situation were typically conscious and able to make decisions immediately after the procedure." She paused. "He said he was your son." I heard what she said, but my brain kept trying to sort it into a category that made sense. Family member worried about a parent. Logical questions. Normal. She seemed to read my face. She said, "He also asked whether the medications given during the procedure could affect cognitive function, whether a patient would be considered legally competent to sign documents in the hours immediately after waking up." There it was. I don't know how long I stood in that hallway. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Louise was watching me with those careful eyes, and I remember thinking, this woman is telling you the truth, and you already knew something was wrong. You knew it Sunday night. You knew it when you couldn't sleep. You knew it when you watched the way Sherry watched you. I said very quietly, "What do I do?" She said, "I already called the hospital's patient advocate, and they contacted the County Adult Protective Services Unit. There's a social worker here who wants to talk to you before you leave." I know this is a lot. I'm so sorry, but I needed you to know before tomorrow. I nodded. I put one foot in front of the other and I followed her. The social worker's name was Denise and she was about 40, with the calm, steady voice of someone who'd had hard conversations before. She explained what they believed was happening, based on what Kevin had asked at the front desk, and based on some additional information. It came out later that a staff member had actually recognized Kevin from a previous visit and had flagged the conversation to a supervisor. They believed he was planning to present me with the power of attorney documents in the recovery room, when I was still groggy from sedation, and have me sign them before I was fully conscious and capable of understanding what I was agreeing to. Getting a sedated patient to sign legal documents. That's not a son worried about estate planning. That's fraud. In Ohio, it can rise to the level of elder financial abuse, which is a felony. Denise told me they were going to loop in an attorney from the county and document everything. She asked whether I wanted to proceed with the procedure as scheduled, and she told me that if I did, they had a plan. I would go through my pre-op and procedure normally. Kevin would bring me in. He would wait in the family waiting area, like a concerned son. And when he approached me in recovery with those documents, if he did, there would be staff present who would intervene and document what happened. She asked if I understood. I understood. I just couldn't feel anything yet. I went home that night and I sat in the chair where Patricia used to sit to read. I sat in it for a long time. I thought about Kevin at 7 years old with a cast on his arm from falling out of the oak tree in the backyard. I thought about teaching him to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon. I thought about the way he cried at his mother's funeral. Genuinely, deeply, the grief of a son who loved his mother. I tried to reconcile all of that with the man who had stood in my kitchen 2 days ago with a folder of documents he wanted me to sign before I went under anesthesia. I couldn't reconcile it. Maybe I never will. Tuesday morning. Kevin picked me up at 5:45. He was pleasant, asked how I'd slept. We stopped at a gas station and he got me a coffee decaf because he remembered I couldn't have caffeine before the procedure. That small act of memory nearly undid me. I sat in the passenger seat of his car with that coffee and I looked out the window and I kept my face completely still. The procedure itself went as planned. Dr. Whitfield found the blockage, placed a stent. Everything went smoothly. I was in recovery by late morning. The first thing I was aware of, coming out of the sedation, was the ceiling tiles, white, evenly spaced. Then the sound of the monitor beeping. Then a voice, a nurse saying my name. And then, at the edge of my vision, Kevin, standing a few feet from the bed, his face arranged into an expression of relief and concern, the folder in his hand. He hadn't seen yet the second nurse on the other side of the curtain. He hadn't noticed the social worker Denise standing just outside the doorway. He came closer. He touched my hand. He said, "Dad, you did great. Everything went fine." His voice was warm. Exactly the right amount of warm. Then he held up the folder. He said, "I have those papers I mentioned. The attorney said it's actually better to do this sooner rather than later, while everything is fresh. It'll only take a minute. I just need a couple signatures." I looked at him. My son, 34 years old, standing in a hospital recovery room with a folder of documents he wanted his sedated father to sign. I said, "Kevin." He looked up from the folder. I said, "I know." His face did something complicated. Something I don't have the right word for. And then Denise stepped into the room. The next several hours were the longest of my life. Kevin didn't shout, which surprised me. He went very quiet. There was a conversation with the hospital's patient advocate, with Denise, with an attorney the county had on call for exactly these situations. Kevin kept saying there was a misunderstanding, that he just brought the papers in case I felt up to it, that it wasn't what it looked like. Sherry was at their apartment. When Kevin called her from the hallway, I could hear her voice through the phone, though not the words. The conversation lasted about 90 seconds. He came back in looking diminished. The formal report went to Adult Protective Services. Where the criminal charges follow is still being determined as of when I'm telling you this story. My attorney, a real one I chose myself, has advised me to keep the details limited for now. What I can tell you is that the power of attorney was never signed. The will Kevin had drawn up was never signed. Everything I've worked for over 31 years of getting up before dawn and coming home after dark, everything Patricia and I built together, is still exactly where we put it. I called Melissa that afternoon. I promised to call her when I was out of the procedure, and I kept that promise, though the call went a little longer than either of us expected. She cried, not quietly. The kind of crying that catches in the throat and comes out in waves. My son-in-law got on the phone and said he was booking a flight for her and the kids to come see me. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said he knew he didn't have to. She was at my house by Thursday evening. She walked in the door and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she held me at arm's length and looked at my face and said, "Dad, I need you to hear me. What happened was not your fault. You trusted your son. That's what good parents do." I've been turning those words over ever since. I've had a lot of time to think about Kevin and how we got here. I don't think it was him alone. I've seen the dynamic between him and Sherry closely enough over the past 2 years to understand that she has a particular talent for finding the weakness in a person and working at it. Kevin's weakness was always that he wanted things to be easier than they were. He wanted money without the years. He wanted security without the work. I don't say that to excuse him. He's a grown man who made choices. But I think if he'd married someone who pushed him toward better instead of worse, the story might have gone differently. I didn't stop loving my son on that Tuesday morning. I want to be clear about that. Love isn't a light switch. You don't just flip it off because someone hurt you, even when the hurt is enormous. But trust is different from love. Trust is something you build slowly and something you can break in a single moment. Kevin broke mine in a hospital recovery room while I was still coming out of anesthesia. I don't know if that can be repaired. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is this. I am 63 years old. I have 2 grandchildren who run to the door when I pull into Melissa's driveway. I have a house I own outright on a quiet street in Columbus. I have a neighbor named, well, I'll keep that one private, who shovels my walk in winter without being asked. I have Sunday mornings with coffee and the crossword. I have enough. Patricia used to say that the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you protected. She meant it in a spiritual sense, I think. But I've started applying it more literally. I have things worth protecting. I'm going to protect them. And if you're listening to this story and something in it sounds familiar, if there's a voice in your life asking questions about your finances with just a little too much smoothness, if there's a document appearing at a moment that feels just slightly too convenient, trust that feeling. Call your own attorney. Call someone you chose, not someone who was chosen for you. Louise, the nurse who stopped me in that hallway, probably doesn't know what she gave me. It wasn't just information, it was time. Time to choose. Time to protect what Patricia and I built together. That's not nothing, that's everything. I keep coming back to the folder, not the documents inside it, not the legal language or the broad power of attorney or whatever else Kevin and Sherry had decided I was too old or too trusting to notice. Just the folder itself. The way he carried into that recovery room like it was nothing, like it was paperwork from the office, like I was a transaction he needed to close before I woke up enough to say no. There's a version of this story where I never wake up in time, where Louise walks past me in that hallway and decides it isn't her business, where I come out of that anesthesia and sign 3 documents I don't fully understand and spend the next chapter of my life watching everything Patricia and I built get quietly transferred into hands that never earned it. That version exists. It almost happened. What stopped it wasn't luck, exactly. Louise didn't stop in that hallway because of luck. She stopped because she had the character to do something uncomfortable. She could have told herself it wasn't her place. She could have protected her job over a stranger's finances. She didn't. That kind of moral backbone, the willingness to act rightly when it costs you something, is rarer than people think, and I will be grateful for it until I die. And I have to be honest with myself about my own part in all of this. I knew something was wrong on Sunday night. I lay in that bed and felt it, that cold, specific unease that your gut produces when your brain hasn't caught up yet. I almost talked myself out of it. I almost filed it under paranoid old man and went to sleep. If I had done that, if I had silenced my own instincts to be polite or to avoid an uncomfortable truth about my son, Louise's warning wouldn't have mattered. I had to be willing to see clearly. That takes something. Call it honesty, call it the discipline to face what you'd rather not face. It doesn't come naturally to people who love the ones they're being asked to see clearly. And then there's what came after. The social worker, the attorney, the long conversation with Melissa, the process of not collapsing under the weight of what Kevin had tried to do. That required something different. Not wisdom, not clarity, but endurance. The ability to keep functioning when your foundation has cracked. To take the next step, and the step after that. I won't pretend it was graceful. I sat in Patricia's chair for a long time that Monday night, doing nothing at all. But I got up the next morning. I went to that hospital. I kept my face still in that car. That counts for something. Kevin made his choices. I'm not going to untangle all the reasons why, but I know that character isn't built in a single moment. It's built in the 1,000 small moments before that, in whether you choose honesty or convenience, whether you do the hard right thing or the easy wrong one. Kevin chose a direction a long time before he walked into that recovery room. The follow was just the destination. I'm 63, I have grandchildren who don't know any of this yet. Someday maybe I'll figure out how much to tell them, what I want them to understand. Not as a lecture, just as something true, is that a life built on taking what you didn't earn is no life at all. And a life built on doing the right thing, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one is watching, is the only kind that holds together when the pressure comes. Louise was watching. Thank God she was.